Hi, everybody. This is Peter Schiff. It is Friday, December 5th, 2014. Everybody is talking about today on the financial channels is the stronger than expected November non-farm payrolls numbers, otherwise known as the jobs report. I heard one reporter describe it as amazing. I was watching on CNBC this morning. Jim Cramer said it was an economic miracle. In fact, he said that this is proof that Europe should follow our example and emulate our economic policy. And of course, I talked about while it is premature to claim success of our policy, I think the only reason that we're printing these type of numbers and that people think it's a recovery is because the Fed hasn't tried to exit the policy. You can't claim success until you unwind it. So the Fed would have to shrink its balance sheet back down to $1 trillion, raise interest rates back to normal, and then if everything is still okay, then they can claim that it's been successful. But of course, I believe the whole house of cards would collapse if the Fed actually tried that, which is why they're not going to do it. But when they have to launch QE4, more people will see, it'll be more obvious that our policies have been a failure. And if Europe was smart, they would avoid following in our footsteps. But let me get back to the jobs report. Yes, it was stronger than many had believed, including me. I had thought that we would start to see a deterioration in the number of jobs being created. I still believe that is going to happen, but it's probably a story for the first quarter of 2015. But let's look at the numbers. The expectation was 230,000 jobs. Instead, we created 321,000 jobs. I think that was the strongest in about 3 years. But again, 300,000 jobs is really not that strong considering the size of our economy, the number of people. These type of numbers used to be routine. The fact that it's the strongest in 3 years just shows you how weak this recovery has been for the past 3 years. They did revise last month's upward. It was originally reported at 214. It's now 243,000. But again, if you actually look beneath the surface of this strong report, there are a lot of problems. First of all, again, more than half of the jobs that were created were low-paying jobs. You're talking about secretarial, administrative, and system-type jobs, waiters, bartenders, retail, also jobs in leisure and hospitality, temporary services. That's more than half the jobs. Also, there's another report that comes out, which is the household survey. This is the establishment survey, the non-farm number, but there's a household survey, and that one was flat. Basically, no gain in jobs in November, and in fact, they reported about 150,000 decrease in full-time jobs. So it was made up by an increase in part-time jobs. And in fact, in that household survey, you'd find that the big job losers went to younger people, people 16 to 24. There was a big drop in their numbers in the workforce, but you had a record number of people 55 and older entering the workforce. Labor force participation, which is still 62.8, which matches the lowest level since 1978. The labor force participation for older people who should be retiring, that's going up. But the labor force participation for younger people who should be entering the workforce, that's going down. A lot of these young people, too, are making the mistake of just staying in college and going for an advanced degree or maybe getting a bachelor's degree, whereas before they might have skipped it because they're thinking that, well, maybe if we get a degree, we'll get a job. Well, a lot of the people who have degrees still can't get good jobs, and I think people are making a mistake by getting, a worthless liberal arts degree because I don't think there's ever been a period of time where a bachelor's degree was more expensive to get but more worthless to have. Yet out of desperation, people are getting them because they can't get a job. Well, they're not going to get a job with their degree, but now they're going to have a bunch of debt on top of that. Also, in the unemployment number, the official rate stays the same at 5.8%. So despite the 300,000 new jobs created, we didn't reduce the unemployment rate. It did tick down a little bit, U6, which is the number where you have all the people who are working part-time but who would prefer to be working full-time. That went down from, I think, 11.4 to 11.3. but 11.3 is still a huge number. Right? Why can't we produce full-time jobs for these millions of Americans who are working part-time but who want full-time jobs? And the answer is because we're not creating full-time jobs. We're really creating part-time jobs. And I believe a lot of these jobs have to do with an anticipation of a robust holiday shopping season and a robust 2015, because everybody is convinced that we have this recovery, that businesses are gearing up to prepare for it. And I think they're gearing up for a huge disappointment. I've described the recovery as a mirage, and the closer we get to when it's supposed to start, I think the more people will see it for what it is. It is a fantasy. It is not a reality. In fact, we've been getting a lot of economic data over the last several months that has been bad. In fact, most of the data that has come out even this year has been below expectations. Despite all the lofty expectations, we get a lot more bad economic news than good economic news. It's just that these marquee numbers, the job numbers and the GDP numbers, those are the ones that get all the press. Those have been better than estimates for a while. But all the other news items that come out, they're obscured by some of these headlines, but they've been bad. In fact, today is a perfect example of this. We actually got 4 releases of economic data today. Of the 4 that came out, 3 were bad. 3 of them were bad, 3 out of 4. But all the media is talking about is the one good number, the jobs number, and they ignore the 3 bad numbers. And this is par for the course. All they do is they grasp onto the kernel of good news, and they ignore, right, an overwhelming amount of bad news. And they say, oh, here's some good news. This validates our thesis of this strong recovery. And then they ignore all the bad news. They dismiss it or they rationalize it away because they don't want to challenge that narrative. They're just going to tune out any bad news. Now, when they released the jobs numbers today at 8:30 this morning, at the same time, they released the trade deficit numbers. And I was watching on CNBC, and they didn't even mention the trade deficit. In fact, not only did they not mention it at 8:30, I didn't hear them mention it at any point at all throughout the day. And they were expecting the trade deficit to come in at $41 billion. Instead, it came in at $43.4 billion. That's a lot wider, a much bigger deficit than had been forecast. And in fact, they went back to last month, the prior month, and they revised that up. It was originally reported at 43, and they moved it up to 43.6. Now, of course, all the headlines that I was reading, and not that many newspapers even wrote about the trade deficit. No one cares. At one point, during the 1980s, the trade deficit was big news. In fact, the dollar rallied today across the board on the jobs data. But back in the 80s, it would have tanked on a trade deficit this bad. In fact, they couldn't even contemplate trade deficits this bad back in the 1980s. They were a quarter of the current size. But if they were worse than expected, the dollar always got clobbered. Here, it's much worse than expected, and nobody cares. And maybe it's because these deficits have gone so beyond what anybody rationally feared back then that people have been lulled into a false sense that, well, it doesn't matter. But the effect of these enormous trade deficits is cumulative, and it is going to matter. But nonetheless, this was a bad number. But the way the newspapers reported it, all the headlines were, trade deficit shrinks. Well, the only reason it shrank was because they upwardly revised the prior month. The fact is, it came in at 43.4, which was much larger than the 43 that they originally reported. It's only shrunk because they revised that prior month up. But so the headline makes it look like it's good news. The fact of the matter is it's bad news because the number was much bigger than people thought, and they revised the prior month and made it worse. Now, all of this is going to take down the fourth quarter GDP numbers, but no one is worried about that. The fact that we had a bigger trade deficit. And, we have all these people, right, 300,000+ more jobs, but collectively, these people are not productive because we're having to import more. If we were creating productive jobs, our trade deficit would be going down. But because we're not creating those type of jobs, we have to import the products that our people are not making. Even though they're working, they are not working in goods producing areas, which is where they need to be. So that's one data point that came out bad that everybody ignored. The second one was factory orders. And there we were looking for a drop of 0.3. Instead, the drop was 0.7. So factory orders declined by more than twice what they had been forecast to decline. And this is the third consecutive month that we've seen a decline in factory orders. The last time that happened was in 2012, right before the Fed launched QE3 to save the economy. And prior to that, it hadn't happened since the financial crisis of 2008. So 3 consecutive months of falling factory orders. This is not good news. But again, nobody cares about this report. Everybody just focuses on the good news that came out on jobs, and they ignore all of the bad news. And now let me get to the fourth data point that came out, the third bad one, but the fourth on the day came out later, and that was October consumer credit. And people were looking for a expansion of consumer credit to 16.8 billion. Instead of growing to 16.8 billion, it dropped all the way down to 13.2 billion. And to make matters worse, the prior month, which was originally reported at 15.9, they reduced that to 15.4. So instead of last month's number getting better, last month's number got worse, and this month's number is even worse than last month's number. Right? And they expected this month's number to get better. So that was bad news because, of course, consumers in America can't spend unless they have credit, right? Because they don't have the incomes. They need to be able to borrow money. But their ability to do so is being diminished, and so their ability to spend is also being diminished. So 3 out of 4 bad economic data points that came out, and everybody is ignoring it. And this drop in consumer credit also helps explain why this holiday shopping season is off to the weakest start since the 2008 financial crisis. Sales were down 11% during the 4-day Thanksgiving Day weekend. And probably a reason for that is because consumers can't borrow as much money if their credit is down. And, a lot of people are saying, well, they're rationalizing that by saying, well, consumers, since the economy is so good, they don't need to rush to the malls to get a discount. I don't believe that for a second. But the fact is, people still did shop. Although the number of people that went to the stores during that 4-day period was down 4%, their spending was down 11%. So you can't say that the reason that sales were down is because people didn't want to fight, the crowds on Black Friday anymore. They wanted to stay with their families. They went to the stores. They just didn't spend as much money because they couldn't. Because they couldn't borrow as much money and they didn't have as much money. Because the economy is actually weak. Because, yes, people have jobs, but they have lousy jobs. They don't have jobs that can pay the bills, and their bills are rising. Their utility bills, their food bills, their health care bills, their cost of living, their cable, their internet. The cost of living is going up and people's paychecks are not. That's why they're not shopping as much. It's not because they're changing their habits and they don't care about a deal on Cyber Monday or Black Friday. It's because they don't have the purchasing power because it's not a real recovery. Look, if you believe these jobs numbers, right, this is supposedly the best year for job creation since 1999. This is what the media is saying. Well, if this is really the case, if this is the best year for job creation, why is the shopping season so poor? And why did the Republicans just win in a landslide in these midterm elections that just happened when the voters said the reason they were voting Republican was because they were frustrated by a weak economy? They thought the economy was going in the wrong direction. Well, everybody is so excited about this miracle, this economic miracle of a recovery, except the people who are supposedly living in the miracle. Because to them, it's not a dream, it is a nightmare. A couple of other things I wanted to mention that happened during the week that really didn't get much media attention. The first one was the national debt rising above 18 trillion for the first time. You would have thought that this might have been a big story, but everybody kind of swept it under the rug. And of course, remember that 18 trillion is the tip of a huge iceberg because the real national debt, when you include all the off budgets, all the unfunded liabilities, these contingency liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, government guaranteed mortgages, student loans, bank deposits, pensions, all this stuff rolled in, you're talking about a much, much bigger number. But still, the official debt, 18 trillion. And of course, the debt ceiling is way below 18 trillion because that ceiling has been suspended. So for now, the sky's the limit when it comes to the debt. And at 18 trillion, right, about 8 trillion of that has been added during the Obama presidency. You know, I did the math, and it turns out that President Obama has been president for about, 2.7% of U.S. history since George Washington. Yet he's responsible for 40% of the entire national debt. In fact, it's quite possible. It's possible. We'll see. It'll be close. But maybe by the time he leaves office, he will have doubled the national debt. And if he achieves that, that would mean that President Obama, during his 8 years in the White House, would have added more debt to the U.S. economy than all the presidents from George Washington to George W. Bush combined. But we'll see. It's going to be close. He's got a couple more years, but I got confidence. I think maybe he can pull it off. Another piece of news that came out that got some press. I mean, I think it should have gotten more than it did. It got more than the debt limit, or the debt going through 18 trillion. And that is that China's economy has now surpassed the U.S. economy and is now the largest economy in the world. So, America is now number 2, not number 1. Now, granted, this is using purchasing power parity, which is the way economists generally try to measure the size of an economy. So in dollar terms, right, the Chinese economy is still smaller than the U.S. economy. And certainly per capita terms, right, it's smaller. But when you adjust it for purchasing power parity, the Chinese economy, for the first time ever, is larger than the U.S. economy. And of course, I think it would be even larger if they weren't shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, they're running a race against the United States, and as far as I'm concerned, they've tied their legs together, and that is their currency policy. And so despite the fact that they're hopping around, they still hop past us. And you see, what they're doing is they peg the yuan to the dollar, and so they are restraining the purchasing power of their own currency. So they're holding the people back. If they had not accumulated over $4 trillion of foreign reserves, if instead the Chinese government had simply backed off and allowed the yuan to rise in value, had allowed the purchasing power of Chinese wages to grow, and allowed the prices of Chinese goods to fall for Chinese consumers, I think the Chinese economy would be much bigger today than it is now. In fact, maybe even in absolute terms, it might be larger than the U.S. economy, because the exchange rate of the Chinese yuan would be so much higher that their GDP might actually be larger, forgetting about purchasing power parity. But you know what? I think it's going to go there eventually, and a lot sooner than people think, because eventually Chinese are going to see the error of their ways. They are going to decouple the yuan from the dollar, and when they do that, a lot of other countries are going to make the same choice, and it's not going to be a currency race to the bottom. People are going to be looking to reward their citizens with a stronger currency. And when everybody surrenders in this currency war, that's when the United States really is going to lose. Let me finish up by bringing up one more point. It was 18 years ago today that Alan Greenspan gave his famous irrational exuberance speech. 18 years. It doesn't seem, time really flies. 18 years. I guess it'll be 20 years in 2 years. But I was watching again on CNBC, and Steve Leisman brought this up. In fact, that's the reason I even knew it was the 18-year anniversary, because I happened to be watching television, and he pointed it out. And of course, Leisman wanted to make fun of Alan Greenspan because, the markets went way up in the 4 years following his irrational exuberant speech. In fact, the NASDAQ was about 1,300 when he made that speech, and 4 years later, it had topped 5,000. So Leisman is saying, you see, he was wrong, and, maybe he was 4 years too early, but of course that means he was wrong because he was early. Well, I don't think Alan Greenspan was wrong. It was one of the few times he wasn't wrong. I think there was irrational exuberance in 1996, rather. It's just that the markets got a lot more irrational and investors got a lot more exuberant thanks to Alan Greenspan. I mean, if Alan Greenspan was wondering why there was so much irrational exuberance, it was because of him. It's like a bartender wondering why everybody is so drunk. Meanwhile, he's pouring free drinks. Now, they weren't maybe totally free at that point. They were basically free later. He started pouring even more alcohol because what happened is the NASDAQ bubble burst. And by 2002, the NASDAQ got down to close to 1,100, which was a couple of hundred points lower than it was when Greenspan said it was irrational exuberance. And I believe had Alan Greenspan not acted irrationally, had he not slashed interest rates to 1%, I believe the NASDAQ would have fallen considerably further. I think it might have fallen all the way down to 400, in which case he would have given his speech at 1,300 and the market would have gone to 400. So he would have been dead on, just early. But his own prophecy wasn't fulfilled because of his own actions. If it wasn't for Greenspan's actions, he would have been proven right because the markets would have collapsed even more. But he came and saved the day by slashing interest rates to 1% and laying the foundation for the housing bubble that he would inflate with his 1% interest rates and then the measured paces by which he ultimately raised them back to normal and pricked the bubble, and we had the financial crisis of 2008. But I would say that if we're going to talk about irrational exuberance in the market, 18 years ago is nothing compared to the irrational exuberance that we have today. I mean, today we are off the charts irrational and exuberant considering the enormity of the problems. I mean, the challenges that Greenspan probably understood that we had back in 1996 are nothing compared to the challenges we have now, thanks in no small part to all the things that Alan Greenspan did since 1996 and all the things that Ben Bernanke have done and now all the things that Janet Yellen has done and will continue to do in the future. I think things are a lot worse now than they were then, yet people are that much more exuberant. And again, remember, none of the so-called experts who are talking about the economic miracle and these amazing numbers and how our economy is the envy of the world, none of these guys saw the problems at the peak in 2000. They didn't see the problems in the housing market or the coming financial crisis in 2007 and 2008. So they have a lousy track record when it comes to identifying in advance the problems that underlie the economy. And I think the problems underlying the economy now are bigger than ever, and the experts are blinder than ever. That's it for now. Oh, I do want to mention, I know I said one last thought, but this is the last thought, that I am making available for the holidays copies of my father's book. I did make available copies of The Kingdom of Malts, and many of you have already purchased that book, and we still have some copies left. But I do have copies of my father's first book, which is where The Kingdom of Malts originally came from. It was initially part of The Biggest Con, but the editors took it out. And so the original Biggest Con was published without the section or the chapter that included the Kingdom of Malts. My father, on his own, published The Kingdom of Malts in 1980 as a standalone book. But the Biggest Con came out in the early 1970s, and that is his definitive work on economics, and it's the book that was the most influential in my life. So people always want to know, why do I think the way I did? It's not because I graduated from UC Berkeley and took econ courses there. I mean, my economic understanding has more to do with what I read in The Biggest Con and the things that my father taught me about when I was young. So it's a fantastic book. I've read it several times myself. And, whenever I read it, I learn something new. So if you've never read it, you're probably going to learn a lot of things. We don't actually have that many copies yet left. So unfortunately, we're probably going to run out. So not everybody who wants a copy is going to be able to buy one. But we still have some. And so if you want to get them before I run out, if you order them now, you might even be able to give one as a gift. The Biggest Con is $30. The Kingdom of Malts is $25. I am putting the two together for $50 if you want to buy one of each. For a Christmas special. In order to buy the books, you go to schiffbooks.com, SCHIFF books.com. And I'll apologize in advance if we run out of Biggest Cons before you're able to place your order. And again, I know it's been about a month since I've done an official Schiff report. I've been traveling a lot, but I have been doing my podcast. I've been doing several podcasts a week. And so if you've been waiting a month to hear what I have to say, it's only because you haven't been checking on the podcast. So if you're just getting the emails about a new Schiff report, make sure and go and look for the podcast. You can see them on YouTube. You can get them at Schiff Radio. You can sign up to receive them on iTunes or other places where podcasts are, because I'm doing 2, 3, 4 of these a week. So there's plenty of information, even if it's 2 weeks or a month between Schiff reports. It's no more than a few days between podcasts. So I'm always commenting on all the news. And so if you want to be kept up to date, make sure, again, to subscribe to my podcast. Again, schiffradio.com is where we're also hosting it, which is where I used to do my daily radio show. Bye for now.